Good evening, and welcome to the Master Gardener program on managing pests while protecting pollinators. I'm Dina Henshin, branch manager at Middleburg Library, and your host tonight. Please feel free to send me your comments and questions during the program by using the chat feature, and I will relay them to Emily at the end of the program. Emily May is the Agricultural Conservation Lead in the Xerces Society's Pesticide program. She received a Master of Science in Entomology from Michigan State University and has studied pollinator habitat restoration, soil nesting bees, and the effects of pest management practices on wild bee communities. Her work with Xerces since 2015 has focused on supporting pollinators with habitat creation and protecting bees and other beneficial insects from pesticides. Welcome, Emily.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate you bringing me in to talk about managing pests while protecting pollinators. So tonight we're going to talk about just a very brief intro to pollinators, some of the ways in which pesticides, when used in a garden environment, can pose risks to pollinators, and then what we can do to minimize risks in the way that we are managing our yards and gardens. So,
Wonderful.
awesome. And I appreciate, put your questions in, and I would love to be able to answer them more specifically at the end of the presentation. So if you're not familiar with my organization, Xerces, we're a nonprofit organization that's focused on protecting all of the natural world through the conservation of invertebrates and their habitats, invertebrates being spineless animals, lots of terrestrial insects. Invertebrates are really essential animals for the natural world as we know it. They play really critical roles all over the place, helping break down organic matter with healthy soils, keeping pest populations in check, and serving as food for other animals, as well as pollinating crops and wildflowers. Among the many services provided mainly by insects is pollination, which is critical for natural ecosystems and our diet. There's lots of different animals that visit flowers, usually for that quick hit of sugary nectar, and they end up pollinating those plants. That includes insects like butterflies, moths, flies, beetles, wasps. It includes vertebrates like birds. In some parts of the US, it would be bats as well. But also bees, of course. Out of all the animals that visit flowers, bees are the VIPs, or the very important pollinators. I think we're also increasingly realizing moths play that role at night as well. But in daytime animals, bees are these really incredible pollinators. Many of those insects on the previous slide visit flowers for nectar and then move pollen around sort of by accident. Bees are actively out there collecting and moving pollen from flower to flower, bringing it back to their nests in order to feed their young. They also tend to exhibit some behaviors that are really important for the plants that they're visiting. One of them is called flower constancy. So they tend to visit the same kind of flower over and over again because it's more efficient for them than learning how to get pollen out of a new kind of flower, which is actually a great behavior for plants because it means that the bee is mostly bringing them pollen from that same kind of plant instead of clogging them up with other different kinds of pollen from other plants. Bees are highly diverse. There are nearly 3,600 different kinds of native bees across the US, and they come in a lot of different colors and sizes. So where you all are in Virginia, you actually are, you have some really wonderful native bee researchers in the Mid-Atlantic, folks at University of Virginia, as well as at the USGS Bee Monitoring Lab, which is in Maryland. And these photos come from that lab in Maryland. So these are photos from bees, different bees that carry pollen on all different parts of their body. The different parts of their body where they have these special hairs for collecting pollen can be related to the kind of flower that they've evolved to pollinate. Some are carrying pollen dry on their legs or all over their bodies. Some are just carrying it right on their bellies down there at the bottom. You can see that that belly just has so much pollen. And that bee is a really efficient pollinator of things that have open flowers like apples. The diversity of pollinators, their shapes and sizes, where they have pollen collecting hairs, how long their tongues are, all of those features are echoed and reflected back in the diversity of plant shapes and structures, where those plants are offering their nectar and their pollen rewards, how those are accessed and transferred when a pollinator lands on a flower, crawls into, hovers in front of, a flower. So each one of these flowers has a different pollinator story to tell. When most people think of a bee, they think of a honeybee. The honeybee is a single species, really important for US agriculture and for bakers and tea drinkers who like honey. It's a managed species introduced from Europe, so it's not at risk of full extinction, but it does face a variety of challenges. This year has been maybe the worst year in 30 years for the honeybee in terms of the number of colony losses across the country. Because of beekeepers' close relationship with this species, these bees have some of the best documentation in the country. So hive losses of honeybees are really a canary in the coal mine for all of our pollinators. Our native bees tend to look different from the honeybee in how they live. The vast majority of our native bees live in the soil with only these tiny holes to show that they're there. Another third or so live above ground in tunnels and old snags and in pithy plant stems, like this small carpenter bee here, which is poking out of a blueberry cane. And the other very small percent, 1% or so, are bumblebees, which live in small colonies, and they nest in cavities, which are things like old rodent holes, old mouse nests, holes in trunks of trees. Sorry, my Bluetooth headphones cut in there. Hopefully you can hear me again. So the bumblebees can live in cavities that are either above or below ground that they're able to find and form a nest in. So there's a good amount of evidence that on the whole, we are seeing declines in abundance of our pollinating species due to a lot of the same stressors that threaten all kinds of wildlife: habitat loss, pesticide use, diseases, climate change, competition from non-native species. Each one of those things is something that we can work to address. So what we can do to help pollinators thrive, there's really three basic things that bees need for good habitat. They need food, which is nectar and pollen, shelter for nesting or overwintering, and refuge from pesticides. So food for bees, right? This is sort of the healthy habitat pyramid here. You've got your food, you've got your shelter, and you have protected that habitat from pesticides. So I'm going to assume that you all are already on that path to considering how you can get pollinators into your yard. But now we're going to talk about pesticides and as a factor in insect decline and how we can deal with that in our own spaces. Before I do, I want to take a step back and really think critically about why and how we even use the word pest. People have a tendency to want to categorize things very carefully as good or bad or black and white. And what many may not realize is that most insects are at their very worst neutral, and probably most are actually beneficial in some way for ecosystems, for food webs, or directly beneficial to humans. There's only a very small fraction of insects that we would consider pests, being some kind of unwanted insect, either as a nuisance or as a pest of something that we want to eat, for example. So even those species that can be pests can be beneficial at some point in their life. I started to get into learning about nocturnal pollinators, the ones that are active at night, and learned that the fall armyworm, which is a moth species that has a larvae, a caterpillar, that can be damaging to a number of crops as well as to turf grass in the southeast. But as an adult, it's actually a really important pollinator in some food crops like apples. So one pest is it's a pest as a young adult, and then as it becomes an adult, it actually becomes a beneficial insect. So these animals have nuances to their lives. But most of the chemicals that we're using for insect management or disease and weed management are harmful to more than just their target species. When I say pesticides, I'm not using it to just mean insecticides, things that kill insects, but it's an umbrella term. So when I say pesticide, I mean all of the sides: herbicides, insecticides, fungicides, etc. Just so you know that that's what I mean when I'm saying it in sort of a broad term. When we think about pesticides, we're often thinking about agricultural areas where they're used for crop management, but there are 60 million pounds of pesticides used in residential areas, representing about a quarter of all insecticide use in the US. More pesticides are actually used per acre in residential spaces than in agricultural areas. And typically these pesticides are being used for cosmetic reasons to maintain the manicured landscapes that we come to expect around our homes and communities. But these pesticides used on lawns or patios or around the base of homes can end up in waterways. They wash off, right, and end up in waterways. USGS, the US Geological Survey, conducts sampling of streams and rivers, and they found that about 61% of rivers in agricultural areas contained pesticides at levels that are harmful to aquatic life. In urban areas, 90% of sampled streams and rivers contained levels of pesticides that exceed a benchmark of risk for aquatic life. So this is something to be thinking about in our residential environment. I'm just kind of giving you here the 101, the pesticides 101 on how pollinators can be affected by them, and then we'll talk more specifically about managing pests while protecting pollinators. This is all kind of the background information that you need to know in order to be thinking about it in your own context. The risk of a pesticide is a function of two things, risk being a specific word we use. So it's a combination of the toxicity of a pesticide, how harmful it is to a particular pollinator, and exposure. So how that pollinator encounters the pesticide and how much of it. Basically, in other words, the dose makes the poison. So how are pollinators exposed in gardens? So a pollinator might be sprayed directly. This would be particularly an issue if plants are sprayed when they're flowering. We see this happening, you know, with like the fogging type applications for backyard mosquito treatments. Pollinators could also be exposed later on, visiting flowers that were previously sprayed. Some pesticides really don't break down immediately, so a bee or another flower visitor could come into contact with it, even if the spray happened when those insects weren't around. Thinking about bees, we know many of them live underground. Some of them, which live above ground, are collecting soil or collecting leaves to line their nests. So they might be collecting nest materials from plants that contain pesticides in them or soil that has been contaminated. So that can lead to long-term exposure of bee larvae. And then finally, and this is a really important point, there's a lot of pesticides now that are what's called systemic. So they're these very water-soluble, highly mobile chemicals that get moved into plants. They get absorbed up and moved inside plant tissues, including leaves, as well as flowers and pollen and nectar. And this is a concern really for all plant visitors. This would include caterpillars feeding on the plant, as well as flower visitors like hummingbirds, butterflies, bees, etc. So with systemics, which includes things like some of the grub treatments that are used on lawns, some of those are systemic and can then make their way into plants nearby as rain comes down. So pollinators can really be exposed for a long time when plants take up those systemic pesticides. So all of these things are things that I'm immediately cluing into when I'm thinking about pesticide use in gardens and around yards and homes. The trouble with pesticide use is that it's invisible. We can't see it. So there can be these hidden risks from use of chemicals, even a very long time ago in some cases. One of the examples is insecticide uses on trees. So maybe you had a tree that was struggling, so you call a tree doctor, an arborist, and that person might inject or otherwise treat the tree with a systemic insecticide or fungicide. And the most common class of systemic insecticides is the neonicotinoids, which you may have heard of if you follow pollinator conversations. These are chemicals that are very highly toxic to bees, very persistent, and can last for a long time in woody plants, especially when they're designed using a method designed for that pesticide to be taken up by a plant, like a trunk injection. So a study from looking at rhododendron found that blooms and leaves could be contaminated the following year from a systemic application to a rhododendron plant. So that's a concern, right? We want to be considerate of what kinds of trees we're treating with these systemic applications, knowing that many trees are highly visited by bees and other pollinators in the spring when they start flowering or putting out pollen. Another thing that we might not be thinking about in the home environment are perimeter and foundation treatments for termites and carpenter ants. So that's a very common application type around homes. But many of these products used to treat for termites are both systemic and highly persistent. So the main chemical in Termidor, for example, is fipronil, which is highly persistent. Our team at Pesticide Program at Xerces has done some sampling projects to try and characterize pesticide residues in plants. And we did some milkweed sampling in California. One of the places we sampled was around the home of one of my coworkers. And pesticides, since she had moved into the house 6 years prior, and she had not been using any pesticides, but the milkweed that she had planted the year she moved in was contaminated 6 years later with the perimeter treatment used by the previous owner of the house for termites at levels that were potentially risky to monarch butterflies. So that's a concern that you might not be aware of, but if those are treatments that are being used around your home, some of those foundation plantings you might want to move farther away from the base of your home. Pollinator attractive plants around the exterior of these kinds of houses might be a source of pesticide exposure if you've been treated with a systemic insecticide for those structural pests. We also have done some residue sampling of nursery plants, finding that they were almost, unfortunately, universally contaminated with a variety of pesticide residues, including these systemic insecticides that are found throughout the plant. And it's really frustrating to think that you could be out there trying to find native plants for your pollinator garden, only to be bringing home plants that could harm some of those insects. So we have developed a couple of resources to help with this. One is for consumers buying bee safe plants, and one is for nursery managers on pollinator friendly practices at nurseries. So both of these are trying to help guide conversations with local nurseries about the kinds of practices they might be using and provide more information on both sides of that conversation. And at this point, I've really heard many people tell me that they've been able to bring these concerns to their local nursery and see actual changes in the choices being made or the plant sourcing that nursery is doing. So it's really worth a shot having that kind of conversation with your nursery. Just to give a little bit more background information, insecticides are obviously the most obvious danger to insects like pollinators, but other kinds of pesticides used in home and garden environments can have impacts. Fungicides are chemicals that kill fungi, that damage plants. They're widely used in a variety of landscapes. Typically, they tend to be the most abundant thing when we sample in bumblebee and honeybee hives. This is the kind of pesticide that we find the most frequently. And bees that are exposed to fungicides appear to be more vulnerable to certain pathogens, probably because the fungicide is disrupting the gut microbiome, the microflora, and making that bee more susceptible. Or it's something about how they actually detoxify that pesticide in their body. So some fungicides can effectively actually multiply how toxic insecticides are when that pollinator is exposed to them at the same time. So these are very subtle harmful effects that are not assessed in the body of research that's required in order to get a pesticide to market. If you're interested in learning more about fungicides in particular, we do have a fact sheet about that on our website. Herbicides, which kill plants, are also very common. Your most common lawn chemical is going to be an herbicide used to treat broadleaf weeds. And the main impact there is the loss of flowering plants. They kill flowering plants that provide food for pollinators. They're generally lower toxicity compared to other pesticides on contact, but there is increasing evidence that they have some effects similar to fungicides in that they can make bees more vulnerable to other stressors. So if you have a lot of herbicides going into the soil, you have soil nesting bees, there's the potential you could be making some of those bees nesting there a little more vulnerable. So I'll keep moving on here just to say that some of these that we don't typically think of as being harmful to bees can have these subtle impacts that are still important. And then finally here on the background, just to talk quickly about organic pesticides. Just because a pesticide is organic doesn't mean it's non-toxic or doesn't present some kind of risk. You know, I've heard frequently like, oh, I just use neem oil in my garden. It's really important that we know how these chemicals actually work to know how they might harm an insect. Neem oil and its active ingredient, active component, which is azadirachtin, these are what's called an insect growth regulator. This is something that its mode of action is that it has harm on developing larvae. So it is organic, but it is not something that is safe for caterpillars, for example. So thinking about where that's being used, you wouldn't want to use neem oil on something that you've planted as a butterfly host plant, for example. Same story for BT. This is another common organic pesticide. It's a soil bacterium that produces these proteins, crystalline proteins that poke holes in insect stomachs. And different kinds of BT are specific to different groups of insects. So the most common one is a strain that targets butterflies and moths. So it's practically non-toxic to bees, but it's not safe for butterflies. So it's really just important that you know how a pesticide works and what sort of spectrum of insects it might affect. This is not to say that organic pest management is on par with conventional pest management. Many of these organic chemicals break down much more quickly in the environment than conventional synthetic pesticides do. So just wanted to clear up some of that. There's a lot more we could talk about this. But many of those synthetic chemicals last days to weeks longer in the environment than their organic counterpart. So now that you know all of that, let's talk about how we manage pests in our homes and gardens with or without the use of pesticides. Protecting pollinators from pesticides, an important first step is really just considering pesticide products to be the last rather than the first line of defense if you have something that you don't want in your yard. So we're wanting to see more gardeners using prevention first management to really understand what kinds of insects and diseases they have in their yard and figuring out what kinds of steps they can take to break those cycles without needing to turn to the use of pesticides. We're also wanting to see more gardeners turning away from using pesticides for cosmetic reasons. In many cases, those kinds of cosmetic issues can be avoided in the first place by planting something like the right plant in the right place, by providing habitat that supports beneficial insects that provide pest control and keep pests at a manageable level. And then just being patient, you know, all of this building of a functional and resilient system where you can be a little more hands-off takes a lot of time and a lot of patience with yourself too. So we're going to talk about prevention first pest management here. So we're going to start with just building that good foundation. So maybe your mother said this, maybe they didn't, but mine said an ounce of prevention saves a pound of cure. So prevention is really the foundation of successful ecological pest management. And it's why we emphasize this as a strategy for reducing use of and reliance on pesticides. It starts with a foundation of good planning and design, figuring out the right plant for the right place, working to build healthy soils and fertility, increasing plant and beneficial insect diversity, and then spacing plants out so they receive good airflow and sunlight. You're a master gardener group, right? Or maybe not, but if you are a master gardener group or you have master gardeners in the audience, you already know much of this.
Yeah, so the master gardeners are a big part of the audience, but it's open to everybody in the public. So we probably have a mix and match.
Okay, great. I was like, I'm pretty sure that there's a master gardeners group associated here, but
Yeah, definitely.
it's already been a long week. I apologize.
No, that's fine.
But yeah, diverse plantings tend to be more resilient to damage and stressors, and they also tend to support all of these cool beneficial insects that help keep everything else in check. Many insects that eat and parasitize pests use diverse habitat, use these plantings to help support their own lives and keep other insects that show up from reaching any kind of outbreak level. So it's really great to attract these species that prey on pests that provide this biological control. And it's a really fun way to become more observant in your own garden, is to learn to recognize some of the the common beneficial species that might show up and to help promote them, to help pests from becoming a problem. So some of the things that you might learn to recognize and might find in your yard include things like predatory ground beetles, assassin bugs, minute pirate bugs, lacewings, predatory wasps, spiders. If that doesn't intrigue you, look up a minute pirate bug. There's a reason that they're called that. Green lacewing adults eat nectar and pollen, but the larvae feed on things like aphids, mites, and eggs. Predaceous ground beetle adults eat soil-dwelling insects like cutworms and root maggots. So there may be a really good pocket ID resource for Virginia. I should have looked this up beforehand, but it's a good opportunity to go out and identify what's in your garden and what it might be eating. In your garden, we're looking to plant resistant varieties, choosing species and varieties that are well suited for your condition. So it could mean choosing a vegetable variety that's resistant to or tolerant of certain pathogens like downy mildew. Tomatoes are an example of a plant, obviously, that's susceptible to a variety of pathogens, late blight, early blight. So if those have been an issue in your garden, you can look to plant varieties that have more resistance going forward. That's usually something that's advertised in the seed catalog. And if not, you can look up, Cornell University actually has a really great guide to resistant varieties. In perennial plants, there are also, there's sometimes horticultural varieties that are more resistant to certain diseases, but for wildflower gardening, typically it's planning out resilience is more about picking the right species rather than the variety that is going to be tolerant of the conditions in your yard. Prevention-based management is also about building up the soil, making sure you've got good drainage, managing soil fertility and pH, adding organic matter to very sandy or heavy clay soils. You can take that soil sample, send it in for testing at a variety of soil labs, and learn a lot about how you might be able to better manage your soil for the right conditions that you're looking for. And then one other thing that I think a lot of us might not spend as much time thinking about is how to water wisely. So not too much, not too little. But one of the things that I learned in the process of becoming a better gardener was that overhead sprinklers tend to water just the top inch or two of soil and promote shallower root growth, which in terms of withstanding heat and drought stress later on, might not be as strong a foundation as using something like a soaker hose or drip irrigation to be able to promote a little bit deeper root growth and help your plants withstand that drought stress later on. The next step over that was sort of the baseline of planning out and prevention. Then there is more active prevention using things like barriers and mulches to help exclude insect pests or weeds if that's something that you're running into as a gardener. Something like floating row covers can be used to exclude things like flea beetles from brassicas or early season cucumber beetles from cucurbits. In perennial beds, it might be something like a mulch to help with weed control and moisture retention. If you're a mulcher, I will say, knowing that we have lots of bees that are nesting in the soil, one practice I try to use is if I'm using mulch, which I do for certain beds for weed control, I try to leave some space in the back unmulched so that bees are able to kind of get in there and create some nests. Other preventive steps are things like pruning, just for airflow, using trap crops to attract and manage insects that might otherwise become pests. For my tomatoes, I plant a row of lovage on either side because I've had tomato hornworms come in, and that's a way to sort of trap them before they get to the tomatoes. Using trap crops isn't a one-size-fits-all approach, but it can fit into a home garden setting, and it kind of just depends on what your setup is and what pests you've been dealing with over the years. But problems do arise even in the most well-planned gardens. And when you've put so much time and effort into something, building a productive garden or building a beautiful, resilient wildflower space, it can be frustrating to see your plants suffering from an insect pest or a disease. So we're going to walk through some of the general process that you might use for approaching a pest. So starting with, what are you seeing? Are you seeing insects, plant damage, or other symptoms? Sometimes the most obvious issue is plant damage and you're not seeing insects on the plant. So you can look closely at or around the plant for evidence that insects have been there. That would be things like frass, which is insect poop, fine webbing or mining trails in the leaves. And then what kinds of other symptoms are you seeing around leaves and flowers? Are there skeletonizing or dieback, spotting, browning, curling? These things, these days, a smartphone can be actually a very useful tool for taking photos and notes to help identify the specific issue, when you started to see the problem emerge, how many insects are present or how much damage you're seeing. So all of those things are going to help with identifying and then figuring out what you want to do about the problem. As an observant gardener, I'm sure all of you are, I do tend to notice when things start to look weird. So one of the years I was gardening in Connecticut, I spotted these deformed flower heads on my purple coneflower, and I didn't know what was going on. Looking closely, I could kind of see the frass and the webbing in the middle of the flowers. But in order to make any decisions about what you're going to do, you really want to know what it is you're looking at and something about its life cycle and its habitat needs. So in order to make a decision about management, I wanted to know what I was looking at. Just because something isn't eating your plants doesn't mean you need to do anything about it. Doesn't mean it's actually harmful to the plant. It might be beneficial in some way. So once I pulled apart a flower head, I could see this brown and tan striped caterpillar inside the flower head. And I did go to entomology grad school, so I was able to, I know what resources to go to. Not everybody knows an entomologist, but there are a ton of online resources available to help with identifying insects and plant diseases. So a quick internet search, but brown and tan striped caterpillar on a coneflower could help. But you do want to be careful about over-interpreting from that. So there's cooperative extension, master gardener hotlines, plant diagnostic or state diagnostic laboratories of different kinds, which can offer advice tailored to a local area. There's also, for bugs, a lot of cool resources available either online or through your smartphone. Bugguide.net is a great resource for helping with insect identification, as well as apps like iNaturalist, which has a community of experts that love to go through and help provide photo identification of insects. So I was able to identify those caterpillars as sunflower moth caterpillars, which feed on the pollen and immature seeds of purple coneflower. So whatever you find in your garden, just like in parenting, sometimes it's good to take a little pause before intervening or making a decision about what you're going to do. A first step is really just double check, does the plant have what it needs? And you can usually tell this from giving it just a quick check, right? Does it have enough water? Does it have nutrients? Does it have the right sort of setting, airflow, spacing? Stressed plants are going to look a lot worse and have a difficult time mustering defenses against infection or against an insect infestation. Blossom end rot, that's a picture on that of those tomatoes with blossom end rot, which looks kind of like a fungal disease, but is actually the result of calcium deficiency. So adjustments to the soil nutrients is the best solution there. And then continuing your pause, thinking about your intentions can help you figure out what kind of level of damage, or as well as what level of management you're going to be comfortable with. Are you trying to conserve insects and create wildlife habitat? Are you dependent on the fruits and vegetables that you're growing for food or for profit? Are you trying to bring a certain aesthetic to your space? Thinking about my own garden, I have three goals. Really, one is to conserve insects and birds and other wildlife, to create a space that's very low maintenance and beautiful that I enjoy watching in the morning with my coffee. And given that I have a toddler and a busy life, I want it to be as little effort as possible. I want a system that is pretty healthy, pretty functional, with as minimal of disturbance or management as possible. So all of those help me in reminding myself that I can just live with a little bit of damage here and there. Just because an insect is present and eating plants doesn't mean that it's a problem that needs to be managed. So before I come back to the sunflower moth caterpillars on my coneflowers and how I dealt with that, I just want to give you another example from my yard. So I planted Pearly Everlasting in one of my pollinator beds, which is a host plant for the American lady and painted lady butterflies. I was super excited when it came up. And then it came up and the second year after I planted it and pretty quickly looked horrible. It was covered in frass, its leaves were all damaged. I thought, what is going on? That looks so bad. But of course, then I looked closer and it was teeming with American lady caterpillars like this. So of course I let it be. And I was so excited to see that the reason I'd put it in the yard was actually coming to fruition here. But I was worried. I thought, well, maybe this plant is just going to look terrible after all these caterpillars are done with it. 2 months later, these plants were huge and healthy and beautiful, and there was no sign that they had been basically eaten to the ground by these larval butterflies. This species and many others like it have had relationships with these larval butterflies for much longer than any of us have been alive, and they can withstand the damage that it's been adapted for. So the presence of caterpillars is not a threshold for taking action. Gardening for wildlife, if that's one of your goals, really means rethinking what plant damage actually means, and it can mean that you're doing something right. You're creating a lot of bird food, you're creating a lot of butterflies. So as your plant being eaten, you can pat yourself on the back because there's wildlife in your garden. There are definitely still times I will intervene. Big outbreaks of certain kinds of insects can reflect an imbalance in the system. There's also certain kinds of pest species that really just get to outbreak levels super quick. But the long-term response to that is to continue increasing diversity, boosting more beneficial insects in the garden. But sometimes things are moving more quickly than my resilient garden planning can adapt to. So coming back to the coneflowers, I didn't do anything until basically every single available flower head was covered in frass and the pollen was being eaten. So I just decided to go in and hand pick basically deadhead a few, not deadhead, just remove the flower heads of some of the most heavily infested flowers. I've also used a similar method here in bee balm, which had a heavy infestation of raspberry pyrausta moth caterpillars. I don't use pesticides in my yard, but I did decide to intervene to try and retain some of the pollen and nectar resources from this species, which is why I planted it. So in response, the plant produced more flower heads, which were less damaged and had accessible nectar and pollen. I didn't take all of the flowers. Anyway, it was not a big intervention, but it was just enough to try and break some of the cycle of that pest and make sure the plant was still producing some resources for other pollinators. In my garden, sanitation, the removal of infested plant material is really a top choice for reducing the level of damage. Things like hand picking, using water to knock down insects. This is an example of a leaf miner in my spinach. So I just picked out some of the most infected leaves and left the rest. That can be a very tedious process. I worked on a vegetable farm and spent a lot of very late nights picking slugs off of lettuce by hand. But it is a very deliberate and cautious approach that can save other wildlife in your garden from harm. Most home gardens can be managed well without pesticides. And of course, I'm here to encourage more folks to go pesticide free. But that's not going to be the case for everyone, right? We recognize that's not where everyone is. Maybe you have prized plants that you can't imagine letting go of, your grandmother's rose bush. So if pesticides are part of your management, we really want to consider using something only when it's threatening the survival of a plant and not so much when it's just having some cosmetic damage. And we want to encourage the use of these preventive or non-chemical steps to try and deal with it before reaching for the pesticide. So if you are deciding to apply a pesticide, here's a few things to consider. Is this the lowest risk option? So have you tried something gentler first, like hand squishing or hand picking that insect? What else might that pesticide harm? So even if the label says it targets really a specific pest, it could also harm some other insects present in your garden. So if you're going to consider a pesticide, I'd ask you to really take some time with the label, look up the active ingredient, and know how it works. Do a little Googling, figure out, what is this? What can it be? What else might it harm besides the insect that I'm trying to affect? Can it be taken up by other plants? And therefore, might it pose an exposure risk over a long period of time? And then what can I do to make this more targeted? Could I just spot treat instead of spraying the entire lawn? Could I use a bait station instead of, for something like ants, rather than spraying the entire perimeter of the house to try and keep them out? And then, of course, I'm going to ask you to ask yourself, do I really need this? Do I need to act? Can I let it go? Those are some of the things that I want folks to keep in mind as you're starting to reach for a pesticide. So a lot of times I end up giving this presentation and then getting questions about mosquito management. So I do want to just talk specifically about that for a sec. The typical conventional backyard treatments for mosquitoes are pyrethroids, which are insecticides that are highly toxic to pollinators and a variety of other insects. Some pest control companies unfortunately use misleading language to downplay the risks of those chemicals and say that they are derived from natural sources. There is an organic insecticide called pyrethrins that are derived from chrysanthemum flowers, but the most typical chemicals are synthetic versions, pyrethroids, that are many times more persistent than the organic version. So sometimes I've heard of pest control companies saying that they're applying something derived from chrysanthemum flowers, but in fact, they are using the synthetic persistent version. The collateral damage of that is really to insects that are nesting and foraging in and around the treated yard, as well as those that come visit in the following weeks. I think the frustrating part about these is as much as it's about wanting to provide this personal protection against mosquitoes, ticks, other nuisance insects, for mosquitoes, these yard treatments really aren't effective, as mosquitoes can be flying for several miles and quickly repopulate treated yards from community sources of mosquito breeding. So these are expensive treatments. They often have a high monthly cost, and they have impacts on pollinators, and in some cases pets, and it doesn't even work that well. So really, we're trying to encourage ecologically sound mosquito management at the community level, so the neighborhood level, the community level, for things like source reduction, right? So encouraging folks to make sure they're staying on top of removing standing water, on an individual level using personal protection, and then at the community level promoting healthy wetlands that have healthy populations of fish and dragonflies and other things that are going to feed on mosquito eggs. And then I'm going to talk about also this larval trap, which is an alternative to using a backyard mosquito treatment. So this is the larval dung trap is an alternative control method for single yards that makes use of the mosquito-specific Bt pesticide. This is a method that has been promoted by Doug Tallamy. I'm sure many of you are familiar with him, and he describes this in his book, Nature's Best Hope. So put a 5-gallon bucket of water in a sunny place in your yard, add a handful of hay or straw. After a few days, the resulting brew is irresistible to egg-laying female mosquitoes. After mosquitoes have laid their eggs, add a commercially available mosquito dung tablet containing Bt, which we talked about as this larvicide. In this case, these dunks are specific to fly larvae. And so the eggs will hatch and the larvae won't make it. But it doesn't attract. The nice thing about this kind of trap, especially the way it's set up on the right, the bottom right here with this hydroponic grow basket that really just prevents other things from getting into the bucket. You're really controlling mosquitoes and only mosquitoes without the use of insecticides, the other harmful insecticides. These are now being deployed in some communities across whole blocks, across whole communities. So if you are concerned about mosquitoes in your local environment, this would be something to talk to your neighbors about, because I think if you are banding together and working to have some of these traps in the neighborhood, it's going to be a more effective and much less generally harmful practice than doing the individual yard mosquito treatments. Importantly, these should never be used in water that drains elsewhere, right? Like a pond or other kinds of regularly available standing water, only in these kinds of containers. So that is the main specific information. I did want to offer some hope for folks that came here and you're like, I already don't use pesticides. I'm not concerned about that part, but I am concerned about what my neighbors are doing. So I did want to offer some hope for those of you who are pollinator gardening and worried about things like mosquito treatments coming in from neighbors' yards, which is really just to say that habitat is a really important solution and that having good nutrition reduces the impacts of pesticide exposure. So bees that have access to lots of native plants, lots of pollen and nectar, are better equipped to deal with the effects of pesticide exposure. So the work that you do to have these native plantings provide pollinators with food and shelter is super important. And then as you get deeper into the work, you can also help to talk to neighbors and engage your community about how to shift practices. We have a lot of community-focused resources and publications on our website, as well as at our Bee City USA website, which is focused really on towns and cities. So I want to wrap up here by just talking about the power of observation, both in wildlife gardening and in sort of pest management, which is really to get observant, to understand what's visiting your yard, what does it look for food and shelter, what does it need, and are you providing that? That's both for the pollinator side and for the pest side. Watching plants and wildlife can really also help improve you over time as an ecological gardener. Moving to a native aesthetic can take a shift in perspective, and getting curious really, really helps. In terms of the pollinator gardening side of things, I like to try and keep track of what is blooming at what time of the year, what's visiting it, what kind of conditions are pollinators and plants responding to, and what's in my neighbor's yard that is just buzzing and full of life, maybe at a time when I don't have anything blooming in my yard. That's a better indication of how that plant's going to do in my yard than how good it looked the day that I went to the nursery. So this is totally encourage you to be a nosy neighbor, talk to your neighbors about their plants. Watching your plants and what visits them is a real part of this constant evaluation of what's working and what isn't for management. Maybe you can't make every change that you want to every year, but you can do some trial and error and work on things in easy to do chunks. My front yard just started with a few pollinator plants and a lot of mowed grass, and my goal is just to take out a little bit more grass every year and improve my management, tweak it here and there so that I can do less over time. So figuring out what grows well, where bees are going to nest, what plants give you that amazing hum and buzz in the garden. As you build more diversity into your yards and gardens, bit by bit, this ends up rippling up the food web to create a more full and functional system. Our vision at Xerces is a future where all landscapes, towns and cities, farms, natural areas, all can enjoy thriving, diverse, and abundant populations of insects and other wildlife, which really takes solutions at all scales, including on the part of gardeners, as well as municipalities, farmers, other land managers. Managing yards and gardens for wildlife without pesticides, or taking a step back from pesticides for some things you might have used them for before, can really feel like a big ask. but there are long-term payoffs. And so I hope you'll take that to heart as you work in your own community to conserve pollinators, protect wildlife, and create really functional, vibrant spaces that we can all live in. So I encourage you to visit our website. We have a ton of resources available on plants and pollinators, beneficial insects, pesticide impacts, etc. There's decades and decades of resources in here at this point. And if you go to that website and you say, I'm really looking for a question, an answer to this particular question, and I'm not seeing it, reach out, let us know. We would love to know how we could provide that information to you. So I'll wrap up there. Thank you so much for having me. I'll take any questions you have.
How do you handle in the spring or the fall as far as yard cleanup? That was a question as far as trying not to disturb all the little things that like all the dead stuff and whatever. How do you handle? What's the best way, or do you do it a little at a time, or what is the best way that you handle that?
Yeah, so I'll try and walk through that. I'll try and walk through that like over the course of the season, right? So yeah, I do spring cleanup, and what I'll end up doing is cutting back basically last year's growth. Um, Typically, I don't try and cut it all the way down to the ground. So something like, let's take a bee balm plant as an example. Bee balm is a great plant for something like a small carpenter bee to nest in, or another kind of stem nesting bee. So what I'll try and do in the spring is when I'm doing spring cleanup, which tends to be later in the year as I am seeing insect activity come out and start to develop, I will cut back last year's growth at maybe a foot off the ground, maybe a foot, maybe a foot and a half. Things that have fallen down and lodged on the ground, I'm more likely to just clean up altogether. But things that's still standing, I'm gonna just cut back so that there's openings for stem nesting bees to get into. New growth goes through the year. I leave it standing over the winter. So for example, with a coneflower or with a bee balm, that new growth comes up, puts out flower heads. I'm going to leave those flower heads standing all the way through the winter, where birds might be able to come in and use them as a winter resource. And then in the spring, that new growth, again, I would cut back. And I'm aiming for, when things have really warmed up and you're seeing insects again. So this would be, 60 degrees outside or something like that, when you're starting to get your garden on the move. That's not to say that you need to cut back everything. Everyone's gonna have different preferences. I tend to not cut back everything. I like to leave some chaos basically through the whole season. See where I can do that. Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay.
I've done in my own garden. I'm thinking about my own garden. I've definitely veered towards um, native and more messy and enjoying that. It's taken quite a few years to kind of shift to that, but I was thinking about that. Um, as far as pesticide damage, is it possible for gardens to rebound from that if they've seen heavy, like how long is that cycle? Like
Yeah.
if it was heavily damaged by pesticides, but you stopped using it or whoever, not me specifically, but like what's the time that it takes for it to roll over?
Yeah, great question. So it does depend on what the pesticide was that was used and how, persistent it is. But absolutely, wildlife habitat can rebound from pesticide applications. It's not the end of the world. Um, so if you take the example of, your typical backyard mosquito treatment, let's say, someone came in and either it drifted or it was something you applied to the yard. Pyrethroids typically have a half-life of, which is how long it takes to get to half of the ingredient left in the environment, of a couple months. Depends on the pyrethroid, but so it is going to depend on how persistent that chemical is, but it can rebound in over the course of weeks to months.
Okay. I got quite a few thank yous, an excellent webinar, great talk. I don't see any more questions. I am recording this, and Emily has said that it is okay for us to share it on Loudoun County Public Library's YouTube channel. So give that a week or so and it'll be up there. And next month, join us on May 1st for a talk on regenerative gardening. So that's exciting. All the gardening programs right now.
Tis the
Um,
season.
yes, indeed. Thank you so much, Emily. It was a great presentation. We truly appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.